John Chilembwe was born in June 1871 in the village of Sangano in what is today Chiradzulu district in southern Malawi. At the time, the land was not yet called Malawi. By the time he could walk, the land itself had been claimed. Vast areas that had once belonged to African communities were now marked as European estates, drawn on maps thousands of miles away. African families still lived on this land, but no longer as owners. They lived as tenants. At birth, he was named Nkologo. His father, Kaundama, was a Yao man. The Yao people had migrated from northern Mozambique during years of famine and conflict. They were skilled traders and fighters, but their history was complex. Some Yao groups had become involved in the Arab slave trade, acting as middlemen in a brutal system that tore families apart. His mother, Nyangu, was Manganja, the original people of the Shiri Highlands. She herself had been captured during raids, enslaved, and displaced. Slavery was not a distant story in this household. It was a lived experience. As a child, Chilembwe watched his father leave home at dawn to work fields that no longer fed his family. He watched his mother wait, uncertain whether the day would end without violence. Colonial authority was visible everywhere. African men were required to remove their hats in the presence of Europeans. They had to step off paths, lower their eyes, and speak only when spoken to. Failure to observe these rituals of submission could result in beatings, fines, or imprisonment. Even children learned early. Respect was not mutual, it was enforced. Young Chilembwe learned that dignity could be taken without explanation. Punishment was common. Whippings were public. Complaints meant nothing. Chilembwe saw this every day. He saw strong men reduced to silence. He saw missionaries preach love on Sunday, while estate managers whipped workers on Monday. He learned early that colonial rule was not only about land, it was about breaking the African spirit. But his spirit did not break. Mission schools offered literacy, but only within limits. Africans were taught to read so they could obey, not so they could challenge. Christianity was presented as patience, endurance, and submission. Yet Chilembwe listened carefully and noticed what was missing. The Bible spoke of justice. The sermons spoke of obedience. The missionaries condemned African customs as backward, yet defended European violence as discipline. They preached humility while estate owners whipped laborers in full view of the church. Chilembwe began to understand that religion itself had been colonized. In 1892, Chilembwe, now a young man seeking work, met Joseph Booth, a British Baptist missionary newly arrived from England. Booth was different. He openly rejected racial superiority. He condemned the Thangata system. He believed Africans should own land, run churches, and educate themselves. He used the phrase, "Africa for Africans," words that terrified colonial officials. The Thangata system was a colonial-era labor system in Malawi, where African tenants were forced to work for European estate owners instead of paying rent in cash. In theory, it meant help or mutual assistance, but in practice, it became exploitative forced labor, with Africans compelled to work long hours under harsh conditions to keep access to land. In simple terms, people worked for landowners not by choice, but because refusing meant losing their land or being punished. The Thangata system caused widespread suffering, poverty, and resentment, and it became one of the major causes of resistance movements, including those led by figures like John Chilembwe. Thangata was not seasonal. It was constant, unpredictable, and enforced with fear. Nkologo was hired as Booth's servant and cook, but very quickly, Booth recognized his intelligence. Nkologo became his assistant, interpreter, and student. For Nkologo, Booth's ideas gave language to feelings he had carried since childhood. The anger now had structure. On July 17, 1893, Nkologo was baptized. He took a new name, John Chilembwe. It was not just a religious act, it was a rebirth of identity. Booth mentored him, debated with him, and ultimately made a radical decision. Chilembwe needed to see a world beyond Nyasaland. In 1897, Booth and Chilembwe traveled to the United States to raise funds. For Chilembwe, it was his first time leaving Africa. America shocked him. He saw segregation, he saw violence, he saw racism. But he also saw something new: Black resistance. In the United States, Chilembwe encountered racism, but he also learned more about resistance. He saw African Americans who refused to lower their heads, churches where Black pastors spoke boldly, communities organizing against injustice. He learned that slavery had been challenged and defeated. He learned that oppression survived because it was normalized, and that normalization could be broken. Chilembwe enrolled at the Virginia Theological Seminary and College, a Black institution led by African Americans. Here, Black men preached without fear. They organized, they debated politics, they wrote, they resisted. Chilembwe studied theology, but also history and Black thought. He read about Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, John Brown, whose willingness to die fighting slavery deeply affected him. Chilembwe was ordained in 1899 and graduated in 1900. By the time he returned to Nyasaland, he was carrying ideas far more dangerous than any weapon. When Chilembwe returned to Nyasaland, he married Ida Zuau. Together, they founded the Providence Industrial Mission, PIM, at Mbombwe. The mission was revolutionary. It taught reading and writing, farming and carpentry, clean living and self-respect, economic independence. Chilembwe encouraged Africans to dress neatly, speak confidently, and refuse humiliation. He rejected the idea that Africans should remove hats or bow to Europeans. By 1912, PIM had over 1,000 pupils, hundreds in vocational training, churches across southern Nyasaland. For a time, colonial authorities tolerated him. Then, everything changed. European estates, especially A.L. Bruce estates, were infamous for brutality. The manager, William Jervis Livingstone, whipped workers, denied wages, and burned Chilembwe's churches built on estate land, the final burning happening in November 1913. Colonial officials looked away. At the same time, Chilembwe's life began to collapse. Mission funds declined. He fell deeply into debt. His health failed, asthma, failing eyesight. His daughter Emma died, devastating him. A famine struck in 1913. Hut taxes increased. Refugees flooded his mission, seeking help. Chilembwe's sermons changed. He no longer spoke only of patience, he spoke of justice. When war broke out, Africans were conscripted as soldiers and porters. Chilembwe was furious. Africans who could not wear hats at home were now asked to die for the empire. In November 1914, he wrote a letter protesting this hypocrisy. It was censored. Plans were made to deport him. Chilembwe understood. His time was running out. Chilembwe gathered trusted followers in secret. They planned carefully. White men were targets, not women or children. Weapons would be seized, telegraph lines cut, estates attacked. A wider revolt hoped for. They were poorly armed but deeply committed. Chilembwe believed sacrifice would awaken Africa. The rebellion began at night. Estates were attacked. telegraph lines cut. At Magomero, William Jervis Livingstone was killed, a symbolic act against brutality. His family was spared. Chilembwe did not fight physically. He prayed. On Sunday, he preached with Livingstone's head displayed, declaring, "Let us strike a blow and die for Africa." The revolt did not spread. Colonial forces crushed it within days. Churches were destroyed, rebels executed, villages burned. Chilembwe fled toward Mozambique. He was captured near Mlanje and shot dead. No trial, no grave, no mercy. The British tried to erase him. They failed. Today, Chilembwe is remembered not as a rebel, but as the father of Malawian resistance, a man who refused to remove his hat, bow his head, or surrender his dignity. He lost his life, but he taught a nation how to stand.